Hey listeners, this is your host, Cosmic Wand. Thank you so much for being here. You can check other videos too. Now let's get on to the video. The vessel Ancho, red in the abandoned port on the African coast, was an antique leftover from the Second World War, almost as old as himself although much rustier and still floating on muddy waters out of sheer stubbornness. Still, it was a perfect lair for shady business. And judging by the amount of cargo with the most varied and modern types of military weapons, which were piled up throughout the ship's corridors, this was exactly the lair they were looking for. Strangely, however, although there were signs of recent occupation, at this moment, the pirate ship was silent and deserted, which made sneaky navigation through the dark corridors a little easier. The sound of a slightly metallic and sharp voice reached the team, before they had a chance to approach the command center, at the eastern end of the vessel, where the conversation was coming from. The words were still unintelligible due to the distance. The captain raised his fist in the air, stopping the advance of the team that was following behind. A signal from him to the right divided them into two groups, which would be enough to ensure that all escape points were covered. A slight moving shadow in the periphery of his vision was a the indication the captain had that Black Widow and Hawkeye had understood his command and were moving to cover their positions on the upper platforms. Beside the captain, the man clad in thick iron armor fidgeted anxiously. As always, more than willing to make his arrival a triumphant entrance, simply unable to help being the showman that he undeniably was. However, a new signal from him stopped Iron Man's advance. The captain couldn't see behind his tough mask, but he knew the other would be rolling his eyes at him impatiently. The God of Thunder, on the other hand, had no helmet that prevented him from giving the captain a questioning look, which he promptly ignored in favor of leading the duo through the tortuous paths of the corridor filled with crates, turning the last corner that separated them from Central Command. Their rapid progress took them close to the platform where the usual suspects were having a friendly chat. A quick glance at the mercenaries ahead assured Captain that the team's advance had not yet been noticed. Quite a feat considering the Tin Man at his side clinked with every step. Finally they were close enough to understand the content of the conversation. "On this stone I will build my church," Android Ultron was saying, throwing a cylindrical and transparent tube into the air that glowed with its slightly bluish content. It was vibranium in its pure state. The strongest material on Earth, the captain recognized. The tube fell back into the android's hands and he picked it up easily. The metal-clad AI with inhuman intelligence had a new body. A shape elegantly crafted in steel, the frame of a male body, taller than most men and stronger than everyone. The easy way in which he moved and gestured, almost like a flesh and blood person, made the prospect of his existence frightening to contemplate. Ultron was discussing payment with the head smuggler, Ulysses Clow, complete with clever jokes and sophisticated mannerisms. It was no surprise to find the twin Maximoff brothers with the IA. It even made sense that they trusted the machine at their side more than humans, considering that the flesh and blood versions had treated them like animals. A groan of pain caught the attention of Ultron, the smuggler and the Avengers who were watching them closely from their positions. Ultron turned slightly to the twins right behind him. "Any problems?" he asked with fake concern reverberating in his metallic voice. "She's stronger than I expected. I can't access your thoughts completely." "She is fighting. Very," replied the Maximoff girl, grinding her teeth as she launched a renewed wave of energy towards someone at her side. His hair stuck to his season, damp with sweat caused by exertion. A column in his line of vision prevented the captain from identifying the person they were referring to, a woman, judging by the treatment used. He advanced a few more steps, gaining enemy ground little by little. His companions followed him equally silently. "I know my child," Ultron replied in false understanding, "but it won't be long now. I need you to be strong just a little longer. Do you think you can do it?" Wanda Maximoff nodded in confirmation, apparently seduced by the idea that someone cared enough. "I still don't understand why you want her," complained Pietro, Wanda's twin brother. Her tone sounded hurt, most jealous of the person trapped by her sister's spell. "Every temple needs a deity," Ultron explained, in a tone of obviousness. "And will it be her?" Wanda disdained. "Don't talk nonsense. Of course not. There can only be one God," Ultron replied, turning to give his brothers full attention. He must be the best version he can be. But then, the EA sighed as if he could actually expel air from functioning lungs. I am everything that man is capable of building. Ultron continued, almost spitting out the words in disgust, while looking at his metal hands. I am as limited and imperfect as my creator. But you know what isn't imperfect? Nature. It is pure, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and very balanced, regenerative and highly regulating. Nature works in perfect harmony, like a perfect organism. This fragile, broken girl between you and your sister, Pietro, has within her the most primal and natural power that has ever existed. She could be the perfect evolution of humans, if her own species weren't also corrupt. But that doesn't change the fact that the power enshrined in her is the embodiment of the brute force of nature, and cannot be copied, or recreated, only usurped. Or, well, I hope so. The Maximoff brothers exchanged a look of acceptance. The android chuckled contentedly. Now let's go. We have a lot of work to do, Ultron demanded, dismissing the smuggler with a careless sign. As if brushing away a fly. The captain had heard enough. With a signal from him, Iron Man, the Norse god, and he jumped onto the raised platform, placing themselves between the exit and the dysfunctional group. Pietro pushed his sister and the unknown figure of a woman behind his body in an effort to protect them. However, Ultron didn't really seem surprised to find the Avengers in his path. Ah, Junior, your rebellion is breaking Daddy's heart. Iron Man finally made his grand entrance. Maybe I will do that, Ultron replied, with the same sharp irony as his imperfect creator. Nobody has to break anything. The God of Thunder tried to surrender. You've certainly never made an omelet, replied the EA Sagas. You took the words out of my mouth, Iron Man joked, almost angrily. Ah, Mr. Stark. Pietro stepped forward to the front of the trio, casting a disgusted look between Iron Man and the weapons on display in crates everywhere. You feel comfortable enough in a place like this to make jokes, don't you? My life was never like that, Iron Man defended himself, with a naivety that didn't match his intelligence. The unproductive wordplay was tiring the captain. He stepped forward, trying to at least get a glimpse of the unknown woman, while Iron Man distracted everyone with his chatter, but Wanda moved in unison with him, and managed to continue covering up the other. His hands still glowed with reddish bursts of light, cast onto the person behind him. You two can still get out of this, the captain told the brothers, trying to bring them to their senses. They were both too young to let themselves be corrupted. Oh, we will, Wanda replied, mocking his attempt. The captain did not let himself be shaken. I know they suffered. He continued to see doubt flash in Pietro's eyes. He just needed to push a little harder, and who knows, he could break Ultron's spell over the young people. Ah, Captain America, Ultron sneered, also aware of Pietro's slip. The sanctified man. Pretending that he can live without a war. I can't vomit, unfortunately, but if you believe in peace, let us keep it, the God of Thunder interrupted Ultron's speech, noticing Captain America's discomfort with the android's insight. I think you're confusing peace with silence, Ultron replied. The two hollow holes of his eyes, filled with a strange red energy, glowed menacingly. Iron Man interrupted. What do you want the vibranium for? And what do you want with this woman behind your back? The captain turned his attention back to the unknown presence. But she was still firmly behind Wanda and the android. I'm glad you asked, because I really wanted that time to explain my evil plan, Ultron replied in an amused tone. A second later he attacked. Iron Man was thrown against the walls of the ship by a strong blast of force fired by Ultron, and before the captain could react, several androids with bodies slightly less developed than Ultron fell on top of them. Suddenly, the entire vessel awoke to chaos, and even Klau's henchmen came out of hiding to join in the attack. Iron Man reacted quickly and took it upon himself to face Ultron, machine to machine. The two flew to face each other in the air. The captain barely had time to contemplate the aerial fight that followed, when one of the androids charged at him. He reacted quickly, but the iron skeleton was difficult to defeat. After some effort, he finally managed to dismantle him with a high kick. Confident that his team would be able to react to the droids and deal with the smugglers, he focused on the task ahead, stopping the Maximoffs and getting to the woman in whom Ultron showed a strange interest. Whatever the Eye was hoping to get from her, it seemed like something that would make him even more powerful. which could give him even more of an advantage over the Avengers, which honestly, they didn't need. Pietro was nowhere to be seen, and the captain advanced towards Wanda. She was the only barrier between him and the stranger. The Maximoff girl was startled by his attack and released her grip on the woman behind her to attack him. The still unnamed girl fell crashingly onto the bars. His inert body rolled dangerously towards the edge of the platform, about to fall 3 meters below, onto unstable bomb crates and missiles with sharp edges. Wanda launched a powerful blast of force at him that he managed to avoid with his shield, but he was violently pushed back, moving several meters away from Maximoff and the fainted girl. His appearance, meters ahead, GHT the attention of some smugglers who shot at him. The captain had to fight to gain ground on Wanda again, and when he finally managed to get rid of Klaus, henchman, Pietro knocked him down with his super speed. The captain managed to intercept the boy with his shield. The force of his blow threw the boy onto the lower platform, and the captain followed him, jumping gracefully in front of Pietro, who was sprawled on the ground. He could see the inexperience and fear reflected in the young man's eyes, and was unable to stop himself from hurting him further. "Don't get up, boy," he heard himself asking the boy. He himself would never listen to that advice, but he wished Maximoff was less stubborn than he was. Pietro didn't move, slightly stunned by the fall. The captain turned his back to continue. "Thor, status," he urgently demanded from the communication point as he ran back to the central command platform, hoping that he hadn't missed the chance to remove the unknown woman from Ultron's hands. "The Maximoff girl tried to invade my mind," Thor's voice reverberated through the point. "Be very careful. I doubt humans can resist it. Fortunately, I'm stronger." Thor remained silent on the other side of the communicator, and no one spoke again, but the sounds of gunshots and fighting gradually died down. Everything seemed to have ended as quickly as it had begun. Apparently, Ultron had left in retreat. A few moments later, Captain America finally arrived at the place where the dispute had started. The Maximoff brothers were no longer in sight, nor were any new droids, but the unknown woman remained passed out on the edge of the platform. He stopped in place. This was strange. The captain looked around, expecting to find someone returning to capture her, but no movement caught his attention. However, before he could reach it, he felt a searing pain in his head that threw him to the ground in shock. A dense fog infiltrated his consciousness. Steve Rogers took a slow breath. The air entered his lungs lightly, a sensation he had never experienced, either before or after becoming Captain America. Looking down, he understood the difference. The uniform he wore was no longer blue and red, and it no longer had stripes and stars. All the weight he carried now came from the medals of honor that hung on his chest, firmly attached to his old American Army uniform. The fabric felt good against his skin, more refreshing than your other attire. For some unimaginable reason, thinking about his Captain America uniform caused a slight discomfort, a feeling that he was forgetting something very important. But as he tried to remember what it was, a searing pain hit him hard. It's okay, he didn't need to remember now. That could wait. The sound of laughter and music suddenly filled the air around them. A nightclub materialized in front of him as he entered the premises. No, it wasn't one of the dance clubs that Stark occasionally forced him to go to. Stark. Who was Stark, again? She needed to remember, but the attempt made her entire body contract in agony. It was easier to concentrate on what was happening around him. This place was familiar, almost in a comforting way. It was the ballroom that Bucky had dragged him to in the distant past, a past in which he would remain seated at one of the tables adjacent to the dance floor, fighting to keep his asthma from taking over. While being promptly ignored by the girls who were dancing with his friend, who would be doing his best to distract and amuse his girl and the one who was supposed to be his. But it wasn't the past now. Because he was here, this time, not as the frail, sickly Steve, but as his future self, which was his present. All around him people were having fun. The women laughed in the arms of their boyfriends, and the band played lively music while flashes of photos pierced the slightly reddish lighting of the venue. But there was something wrong, and when he realized it, that feeling of discomfort tickled his mind again, followed by a shock of unbearable pain, which made him lose his breath. He instinctively knew that if he willingly accepted the present around him, the pain would recede. However, he could not entirely ignore the strange atmosphere around him, no matter how much the agony tore him apart. In the dark corners, at the tables furthest from the dance floor, men fought, men died, men cried. And the spilled wine was blood. Suddenly, he wanted to get out of there. He even took a step back, doing his best to ignore the pain that increased in intensity to the point of momentarily blinding him. "Are you ready for our dance?" A soft voice behind him stopped him. She was here. But then, he always knew she would be. Steve slowly turned around, and when his eyes met hers, the pain disappeared without a trace. She was even more beautiful than his traitorous memory could conjure. So adorably real, with rosy cheeks and beautiful, intelligent brown eyes that sparkled with expectation. "Peggy, you're Peggy." Finally, everything was so authentic, and it wasn't. But he wanted it to be. "I could pretend I was, for once." Why not? Why couldn't he live the life that was stolen from him 70 years ago? Was he such a person so unworthy of deserving any moment of happiness? He was sure that if he looked, he wouldn't just find Peggy here, but also Bucci and who knows, his parents. This possibility filled him with joy. He didn't remember ever feeling pain. Peggy extended her hand in invitation, always taking the initiative, but before he could take her in his arms and led her to the dance floor, a slightly authoritative and very distant female voice interjected herself into his thoughts. "You need to resist. Fight. It's not real." He was torn when he realized that the voice spoke of a truth that he was not cowardly enough to ignore, no matter how much he wanted it with all his heart. "The war is over, Steve," Peggy reminded him insistently, as if she was aware of his hesitation. However, she was right, of course. She always had. The war of his time had come or gone. He didn't need to be forever the damn guy to fight every battle in existence. Others could fight, right? He could finally end the fight. "Lower your sword." That didn't sound very good. "Please," the female voice in his mind insistently begged, with a clear desperation that hit him deeply. Who was she? I needed to find out. It seemed important. He made a decision, reluctantly. "I'll be back soon." "Doll," Steve whispered to Peggy, feeling his voice crack. He gently pulled her towards him and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. His lips remained there for a long moment, but it wasn't goodbye, he tried to convince himself. He would return to her shortly. He wouldn't keep her waiting much longer. It wouldn't take long to answer the desperate call that screamed in his mind. Just this once. It would be the last, and then he could lower his shield. However, right now, he couldn't leave a lady in trouble, no matter how much pain the idea caused him. "You will never come back," Peggy stated with tears shining in her beautiful brown eyes. This hurt Steve more than the overwhelming physical pain that assaulted him. It burned him from the inside, harder than when he crashed the plane into the ice. But he would be a disgrace if he didn't respond to that voice's desperate plea. Steve opened his eyes, overcome by the now all too familiar feeling of grief. He had just lost everything, again. How many times would I need to go through this? His back was cold, pressing against iron bars. Because he was lying on the floor, no longer in the ballroom in 1945, but 70 years later, on a pirate ship. Brown, whiskey-colored eyes hovered above him, looking at him with concern. "Peggy," he heard himself murmur, still intoxicated by the realism of the dream, but he realized his mistake as soon as he spoke. The face that watched him intently had nothing to do with his Peggy. He glanced at the platform ahead. The stranger was no longer lying there, it could only be this woman kneeling beside him, squeezing his shoulder as if she were shaking him to life. A slight hissing, almost non-existent to other human ears, but not to his own, perfected by the serum, reminded him that he was still connected to the team through the communication point. Someone was opening the channel. "Whoever is standing, we have to go," Hawkeye asked through the point. Steve uncharacteristically staggered to his feet, strangely feeling his muscles protest as if the nauseating pain that had tormented him in the nightmare had actually been real. The woman, still kneeling on the floor, looked at him with big, confused eyes. "Guys," Hawkeye insisted, after a long moment of no answers. The urgency in the other's voice awakened the Captain America inside Steve again. This was not the appropriate place or time for the question and answer game. He needed to take care of the team. "You come with me," he demanded, placing the woman on her feet with little delicacy. A slight pang of guilt struck him almost immediately, at the hurt look she gave him. It wasn't like him to treat a lady so rudely. But truth be told, he was feeling very strange after Wanda Maximoff's attack, and he just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. Copied Archer. I am heading to the Quinjet. The captain readjusted the point that had moved slightly from his ear. With a firm grip on the stranger's elbow, he led her through the vessel's maze of corridors. She didn't protest, following him as quickly as she could. Does anyone need help? I'm with the widow, the Archer informed. Thor. The captain requested the god of thunder, but the line remained silent. Thor, are you listening? A worrying silence followed, but finally the answer arrived. I'm already on the aircraft. Iron Man. Banner. He continued, anxious about the team's safety. This time, the silence was even longer. Iron Man finally spoke, but his voice sounded tense, which was unusual for him. Another long pause followed. Taking care of Banner. You can board. By the time Captain America and the stranger arrived at the Quinjet, everyone was already on board, including a dazed Iron Man and a sickly-looking Drive. Banner. He couldn't help but wonder how long he had been blacked out. Trapped in the dream created by Wanda, since in the meantime, something serious had happened to Hulk, judging by Banner's condition. However, at this moment, he was in no mood to find out. They were all there, and physically whole, which was more than he could have expected. The reaction of the woman next to him was another story. She entered the spaceship without any hesitation or resistance, slowly walking to one of the vacant seats and sitting down silently, as if she was entirely used to being led around by strangers. The captain became suspicious, remaining alert to her surroundings. He sat in his usual seat, which happened to be facing her chosen seat, and watched her closely in the dim light of the aircraft. However, she seemed harmless and as lost in thought as the rest of the team. Steve couldn't blame anyone for the apparent lack of attention towards the stranger. He himself was exhausted by the intense vision he had just experienced. The feeling of Peggy in his arms had been so real, that waking up without her again was like losing her a second time. The emptiness he felt was as overwhelming as that experienced when he woke up, alone and 70 years ahead of his time. He didn't really need to ask the others to know that Wanda Maximoff had entered their minds as much as his, judging by the ominous silence of his companions. The air was charged with the GHT of the anguish that each person carried within themselves, which, deep down, he knew, had been diligently suffocated over the years, but which were now revived until they hurt like exposed nerves. The girl had awakened horrors capable of incapacitating them far more than any physical destruction would have been. All of them were scattered in 1,000 pieces on the floor. This was too bitter a defeat to admit. The trip had been tiring, even more so because he found himself unable to relax while watching the strange woman between them. There was something about her that bothered him, Eve, and though she hadn't actually done anything that was even remotely threatening. Lost in thought, it took him a while to realize that the Quinjet had already landed in the Stark Tower hangar some time ago. The captain swallowed hard when he realized that no one had made any move to disembark. He stood up to set a good example and encourage others to continue. As expected, the Avengers imitated his movements, even if only automatically. The group disembarked in the hangar and proceeded in silence to the large elevator. As usual, the captain held the metal doors open until everyone entered and boarded last. Pressing the button to start the descent, the steel doors reflected the general despondency of the team behind them like a mirror. The stranger was between Black Widow and Iron Man. The latter kept his steel-clad hand closed over her delicate wrist, as if he was afraid that that little woman could actually escape a super soldier, a god, a man with practically impenetrable armor and 2 assassins, not to mention Hulk. However, the stranger didn't seem bothered. His only sign of discomfort was his hunched shoulders and his eyes fixed on the floor. The elevator finally opened too. The spacious and very fancy room in which they usually rest between missions and occasionally throw extravagant parties that Steve would never attend if he could avoid it. The captain wished more than anything that he could retreat to his personal quarters. However, the woman that Iron Man dragged out of the elevator still needed to be considered first and foremost. He was proud to notice that for the first time since they came together as a team, the Avengers acted harmoniously as they casually spread out across the room, each of them covering the exit points of the room with a defensive posture. everyone obviously silently agreeing that the stranger could be a possible threat. For himself, he took on the task of blocking the elevator and kept a firm grip on his shield, knowing better than anyone that an opponent should never be disregarded because of their size or appearance. The large room lit up, not with the usual softness, but with a strong burst of blinding light, reminiscent of an interrogation room. Possibly the work of Jarvis, or Tony. He didn't think he fully understood how Stark technology worked. Sometimes things happened without any obvious command, it even seemed like magic. It didn't really matter, because the extra white light gave the captain the opportunity to better evaluate the stranger, who remained motionless in the same place where Iron Man left her. With her eyes fixed on the living room carpet, she wore a rather simple and unassuming set of clothes. A pair of flat shoes, baggy jeans, and a grayish sweater that had seen better days. The clothes hung limply from her tiny body, and although wearing clothes 3 sizes too large had a clear purpose, it did not achieve the objective of hiding her excessive, visibly unhealthy thinness. Her hair was light brown, and it hung lifelessly from a thick, simple braid, slightly undone. She wore no makeup, as was common for New York women, and distinguishing her age was impossible, somewhere between 20 and 30 years old, perhaps. There was nothing extraordinary about his appearance. His features were quite ordinary and could have been a forgettable face, if it weren't for the deep dark circles under his eyes. The cheeks sharpened by thinness, and the frightening pallor, which spoke of a difficult life and made his image striking, in a worrying way. Which led him to consider that either she was sick, or had been in an especially bad captivity for longer than he supposed. Although Ultron had escaped from that very same room less than 15 days ago, and therefore, he could not Avenue inflicted damage of such magnitude on someone in such a short time. He shuddered at her stoic demeanor, which showed no shadow of interest in her destiny. Privately, the captain was very worried, because nothing in the unknown made any sense. Ultron had made it clear that he considered her important to his plans, but he left her behind quite easily. And then, when the effects of Wanda's mental closure wore off, instead of running away, she stayed behind and tried to help him. That's what happened, right? As if that weren't enough, the android had referred to her as a force of nature, which should have some serious implications, since he was keeping her unconscious with Wanda's tricks. However, this small and fragile woman didn't seem to pose any threat at all. Yet she still made him uneasy. He sighed in confusion. His immediate apprehension was that it was a trick, that Ultron had lured them to that ship, and forced them to rescue a supposed victim who, in fact, would turn out to be another introduced into the fold of the Avengers. It wouldn't be entirely absurd, since he had tried very hard, up until now, to separate them. Play against each other. If that was the case, then Steve had done exactly what the EA expected. Overall, intimidating a woman as vulnerable as her would have made his stomach turn, but the distrust was palpable in his companions, reinforcing his own uneasiness. He wasn't going to put his team at risk, any more than he already had by bringing them here, just because there was a supposed lady in distress cowering in the middle of the living room. The captain wanted answers. Tony returned from wherever he had gone, now without his armor, and walked towards the girl with determined steps, standing in front of her with a scathing expression. "Little girl, we want some information," Tony said harshly. She finally looked up from the floor at them, and the captain felt guilty for having, earlier, mistaken that look for his Peggy. The shade of brown was identical, but where Peggy was intelligence and vivacity, this girl was a deep well of pain. There was no life in his doe eyes, only hopelessness and agony. She looked at Tony, with the same disinterest she had shown up until then, and without surprises her eyes darted around the room, passing through all the exit points firmly held by the Avengers. She lingered a little longer at the elevator doors, before her eyes jumped, like a cornered animal, to the large glass windows that opened onto the emptiness of the night on the 25th floor, as if that really were a viable escape option. The captain involuntarily shivered at her persistent gaze in that direction. Tony waved his hands impatiently in front of her face to get her attention. "I'm talking to you. Is there anyone in there?" he demanded, almost shouting uncontrollably. The captain took a few steps forward, taking care to remain within reach of the elevator, still at a distance that would allow him to prevent her from escaping, but close enough to Tony to intervene if necessary. Strangely, However, the woman was unfazed by Tony's tone. On the contrary, just for a second, the captain thought he saw something like determination cross her dull eyes. However, he could have imagined it, as in the next second, the glow disappeared as if it had never inhabited that face. She remained silent, and that made Tony even angrier. His heavy hands went up to the girl's arms and squeezed them tightly above the elbow. "Tony," the captain called him in a warning tone. He didn't trust the stranger any more than the others. But that didn't give them the right to hurt her. Tony looked at Steve and blinked dazedly before turning his eyes to his hands. He released her as if he had been shocked and took a few steps back, putting distance between him and her. It seemed that Wanda had even reached the somewhat sensitive Iron Man. "I just want to understand what that was," Tony argued, in an apologetic tone. "And don't we all want it?" Natasha spoke from her place, finally having recovered some of its natural color. "Why is Ultron interested in you?" It was Thor who asked, approaching the duo that occupied the center of the room. She looked at Thor with a slight frown, considering whether the god was worthy of an answer. This was the first display of any feeling the captain had seen reflected on his face up to that point. Silence reverberated through the room for a few more moments. The Avengers shifted in their seats uncomfortably, and the captain became even more suspicious. If she hadn't done anything wrong, if he was in Ultron's hands against his will, why not clarify that fact immediately? "I'm afraid you'll have to forgive me," finally she spoke, her voice slightly louder than a whisper, but strangely intense. The captain was taken by surprise. The voice was familiar to him, he was sure, but in the nightmare projected by Wanda, there was no strong British accent or polite formality. This was definitely not what he was expecting. "Unfortunately, I am unaware of his interest in me," she continued, this time, locking her gaze with Tony. The man crossed his arms tightly, as if he needed to keep them there for control. "Don't do that." Clint left his seat and approached the woman almost with a feline leap. "Ultron mentioned getting a certain power from you." What was he talking about? What power would that be? "Are you an enhancer?" "Sorry, but I don't know what an enhanced one is. Like I said, I don't know what this android, Ultron." She tried the words, and when she wasn't corrected, she continued, "You could have it with me. If he mentioned power, I'm afraid he was unfortunately wrong. If I had any power, I wouldn't have been kidnapped from my own room in the dead of night." If she was lying, she was extraordinarily good at it, so it rang true to the captain, but Thor snorted in disbelief. "In any case, there is no reason to worry," she emphasized. "It doesn't matter if the droid wants something from me or not. He would get nothing. So is there anything to get?" The captain was quick to understand what was unsaid. Your distrust rising one more step. She didn't respond to that, but he watched a slight apprehension change her impassive features. "I'll say what I think." Tony returned to the interrogation, this time, more composed. "I think that Ultron is the best artificial intelligence program that could exist, since part of its composition comes from Loki's own cedar, a power that, let's face it, we barely have the capacity to understand. A creature like that, with practically superhuman intelligence, wouldn't make mistakes. If he says you have a power, then it's easier for you to be lying to us than for him to be wrong." Tony's logic was correct, and the captain saw the woman in front of him struggle to try and dismantle her without success. "I'm sorry, but I don't see why you think I owe you any explanation," she replied helplessly, but it was the wrong thing to say. Because it buried any possibility of innocence that she could have managed to project to the team. It was a definite fact that she was hiding something. Thor advanced on her, surrounding her with his enormous, menacing presence. Despite all the distrust, his movement formed a lump in the captain's throat, and he raised his hand to stop Thor from advancing any further. No one was well enough to go through with this, Steve realized, but they had already gone too far to back down. "We are the Avengers, and we have the authority to interrogate suspects," Natasha lied, with the confidence and ease that only a very well-trained spy could do. The captain didn't like this kind of subterfuge, but he was curious to know how the stranger would deal with it. She didn't even blink. The word, Avengers, bounced off her. Tony Stark even became slightly upset by the girl's apparent lack of knowledge about him. But he knew how to hide his disgust well. "I recognize only American police authority. And only while on American soil. Present me with your badges," That was the stranger's response. The Avengers shifted uncomfortably, caught in their lie. The captain did his best to ignore the exchange of slightly embarrassed looks from the team behind him. He had the strange feeling that her obstinacy was growing in proportion to her offensiveness, which reminded him strongly of himself. The idea intrigued him. Perhaps the smartest thing would be to change tactics. All we want is to avoid making Ultron even more powerful, he said, with a softer tone this time. Revealing your fear in search of an empathetic connection that could reposition you on their side rather than against them could be more efficient than continuing the direct attack. So you're the good cop? She asked, with a slight tone of sarcasm escaping her impassivity. The captain did not dignify the question with an answer, but he did not ignore her wit. The stranger continued, as I said, I don't know what the android expected to get from me. I am absolutely and boringly ordinary, she insisted stubbornly. But stubbornness was Steve's arc reactor. It was all that kept it going, if nothing else. He conveniently ignored that she had understood his intentions very well. If that is so, then we can assume that Ultron is indeed mistaken, he continued. At this point, he felt more than saw Stark bristle beside him, ready to interrupt him, certainly with a long speech about his innocent persistence, of always trusting the best in people, but the captain turned slightly to him, giving him a firm look, which miraculously, for the first time in his life, was able to silence Tony. The captain continued, it would be safe to assume that he will look for her again. We have no reason to believe that he wouldn't hurt you, and even kill you, if you refused to help him. Therefore, I believe that the best thing to do is to keep it under our protection. Thor nodded in agreement and Tasha smiled mischievously in his direction. Thank you for your concern, but I can take care of myself, the girl responded promptly. The same way you took care of it last time, Clint returned mockingly. I wasn't expecting it last time. Now it would be different. Why would you now use your power to protect yourself? Tony insisted, and the captain wanted to hit him, when the woman flinched. As if they had hit a very sensitive spot. Stark, and his big mouth. Let's put the question this way. Natasha also approached the small group that formed in the center of the room. Now, only drive. Ban. NER watched the interaction with interest from a distance. As our only goal is to prevent Ultron from harming people further, we will do whatever is necessary to ensure that his threat is kept to a minimum. That means if we need to trap her here, that's exactly what we'll do. Black Widow had pushed a little harder than the captain would have liked, but she had the best interrogation instincts on the team, so he let her go. I understand, was all the answer they got from her. There was no fear, there was no anger or resentment, no tears to shed, as her vulnerability seemed to suggest she was prone to do often. In more precise terms, I am a prisoner. Whatever name you want to give it doesn't matter to me. You will only get out of this tower if you tell the truth and if the truth does not pose an even greater risk. Tony concluded, resolutely. Excellent. Really brilliant. She sighed, as she took in her surroundings. I have known worse captivity. She sat elegantly on one of the soft and comfortable armchairs in the room, looking at the Avengers in front of her with a slightly raised eyebrow, as if daring them to dislodge her from her seat. Who the hell are you, anyway, see? Lint exclaimed in shock at her absolute lack of resistance or fear. We could have started with the introductions, I would have liked that. But maybe, I'm just expecting too much from the Yankees. It was lucky that she was among the good guys, because for someone who initially flatly refused to talk, she had a pretty sharp tongue. You really have no idea who we are, do you? Tony finally expressed his biggest annoyance. And was positively offended when he received a negative shake of the head in response. Steve hurried to respond before Tony began a speech. We are a very diverse group of people who work to neutralize potential threats to humanity. We are the Avengers. A tired sigh escaped her lips and her shoulders fell in defeat. Hermione. Hermione Granger. Finally, Stark, Clint, thrown on an expensive-looking sofa, greeted Tony's return to the meeting room with a huff of impatience. Steve didn't blame him entirely. The last 87 sleepless hours of chasing Ultron all the way to South Africa had exhausted them all. However, before they could retire for a much-needed rest, having more information about the unknown woman that interested the android so much was imperative. I know that my genius makes it seem easy to do what I do, but breaking into government agencies in more than 200 countries is not as simple as it seems. Tony defended himself, annoyed. So, what did you discover? Steve asked, turning his back on the New York gloom that advanced into the early hours of the morning, to concentrate on the meeting. He had hoped Tony would bring news that contradicted his instincts about Hermione Granger. Because, despite everything, at this moment, he felt uncomfortable with the hurt look that the girl had thrown in his direction, when, just a little while ago, he left her in the room where she was supposed to remain until further notice. That mystery is an enigma within a riddle, Tony replied, shaking the tablet he had in his hands in the air. Jarvis had a bit of trouble locating the little information available. All the records about her wouldn't fill half a sheet of paper. Across the room, Natasha snorted dismissively. That's 83.5 pages less than what appears in your record, Natasha, and you were a spy for two of the most secret agencies that ever existed, Clint reminded her. Casting a mocking half-smile in her direction, it's something to consider. I agree, Bruce Banner nodded positively, only to then flinch at the betrayed look that Natasha gave him. Anyway, Tony continued, Hermione Jean Granger was born in London on September 19, 1992, the only daughter of Mr. Mark and Mrs. Eleanor Granger, also Londoners, dentists and in good financial health. She went to preschool at the age of 4, a year earlier than she should have, because she was considered quite intelligent and mature for her age. Apparently, her parents encouraged a proficient school life, enrolling her in the best educational institutions that money could pay for. She studied piano, dance, Italian and French. I would hardly qualify as mysterious, a suburban girl, Natasha interrupted Tony, with a slight air of disbelief. It seems like a very boring and ordinary life to me, just like she said it was. There's no need to be jealous. You're still our favorite mystery girl, Tony said, winking mischievously at her. The redhead rolled her eyes. Yes, she had a relatively normal childhood. However, the mystery begins shortly after she turns 11. Hermione Granger simply ceased to exist. There is no record of her after 2003. No enrollment in school or university. No medical records. No documents issued. And, as little as credit cards or bank accounts. Niente asterisk. Except for a trip to France in 2005. Where there are tickets and airline reservations issued in his name. After that, poof, she disappeared again, and remained that way for another 7 years. What about the parents? Steve asked. As he feared, instead of an innocent and ordinary woman, Miss Granger insisted on remaining a suspect. Fair question, Tony replied, turning his attention to the tablet. The parents remained in the system. Office address, financial transactions, income tax returns, until 2009, when they also disappeared, just like her. Maybe they made the crossing, Thor asked from his place next to Clint. On the comfortable sofa. If they died, they left no records, Tony clarified, shivering slightly. Approximately 3 years ago, Ms. Granger flew from London to New York, and since then, she's simply been back on the map. And it came back with a bang, I must say. Work, home and bank account. But, with a mediocre credit limit, if you want my opinion. He added unnecessarily, just to show off his hacking skills. She works for the museology team at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is responsible for translating and cataloging texts and documents from Greco-Roman and medieval collections. The Met holds her in high regard, judging by the reports I was able to access. How did she get a job like that without having attended a university, Banner? He asked with a frown. I thought no one was going to ask that. Tony gave the doctor a satisfied smile. There is no CV on file at the Met. It's like she walked in the door one day and started working. Could she have a contact inside? Someone who has employed her without experience? Steve raised the hypothesis, feeling strangely disappointed at the prospect of it being some kind of fraud. Possible, but unlikely. His translation work includes classical Latin, ancient Greek, and a variety of medieval dialects. Tony replied, and before anyone asks, her work that I was able to get my hands on is impeccable. Authentic. Jarvis checked. It takes a lot of knowledge to be an excellent translator, not just of the language itself, but of society and its culture. The Met would hardly hire someone without experience. So, I assume she lives in New York? Natasha asked. Yes, in Manhattan. Tony read on the tablet. A silence fell in the room with the revelations. What would Ultron do with a translator? Bruce asked, some time later. To no one in particular. Well, the lady obviously can't be just a translator, Thor added. Natasha frowned. Are you sure you really researched everything, Stark? She asked, suspicious. So you offend me, widow. Why do you think it took me so long? Tony put his hand over his heart, mock offended. This research was useless. We still don't know anything relevant about Clint added with a groan of frustration. Tony gave Hawkeye a truly insulted look this time. Privately, Steve agreed with Clint. Not that he would tell Tony that, and risk injuring him to death. The captain sighed tiredly. They had done all they could for now. The time had come to draw up plans. He cleared his throat to draw attention to himself. Clint, Natasha, try to find out some additional information about her from her old contacts. Let's assume Hermione Granger is a risk. Steve indicated the directives to be taken as action parameters, now that a new element had entered the Ultron hunting equation. He received 2 identical nods in agreement from the Master Assassins. The others should focus on locating Ultron. He is our #1 priority and stopping him is our responsibility. But for now, I suggest everyone go rest. No one can work well, exhausted as we are. Clint stood up from the couch with an almost indecent groan of relief. I'm leaving, Thor informed solemnly. Approaching the door with 2 long strides. The vision that the Maximoff girl showed me. I need some answers to them, and I'm not going to find them here. But I thought you were going to help us with Ultron, Banner asked, alarmed. I'll be back as soon as possible. I trust you will be able to watch over a little girl with 100 pounds of skin and bones. Thor turned at the door, with his hand on the doorknob. Silently asking Steve for permission to leave. The captain nodded in agreement. Even after 3 years, it was still strange for him to give orders to a demigod, but Thor humbly accepted his command. The big man walked out the door without another word, flanked by the other Avengers who were retreating to their personal quarters to rest for the remaining hours of the night. Steve closed the door behind him with a bitter taste in his mouth. He tried to stifle the guilt that weighed him down, for keeping the young lady cloistered. The silence inside the car weighed suffocatingly on the passengers. And it was only no more massive than the tension that ran between their bodies, as if it were a high-voltage current of electricity. For at least 2 of the 3 travelers, this was not an uncomfortable feeling at all, although never so oppressive. Steve Rogers at the wheel of the Land Rover knew that the apprehension, amplified to the maximum, had nothing to do with a possible attack by Ultron. But rather with the stranger sitting rigidly in the back seat. The state of vigilance that emanated so obviously from her maid Captain America's instincts respond automatically. Ready to get into a fight at any moment. A glance at the company sitting next to him in the white front assured him that he wasn't the only one with stretched nerves, judging by the placable expression and the focused attention with which Natasha Romanoff watched the right rear view mirror, which reflected a fragment of the lady in the back seat. However, he knew that the stranger, Hermione, he corrected himself. Her name curled around his mind with strangeness. He hadn't moved a single millimeter from his place at the window, because he himself had been keeping a careful watch on the central rearview mirror, where he had a good view of her. Miss Granger was a mess. He looked even worse than the day before, if that was possible. Despite being accommodated in the Star Tower's best guest room, she had clearly spent a sleepless night and the sleep deprivation had taken its toll. Under his eyes were hideous bruises. His skin was emaciated, your hair even more dry and lifeless, and its revolting thinness even more accentuated by the daylight. She seemed to desperately need a decent night's sleep and lots of nutritious meals. In hindsight, he had to admit that 6 people, only one of whom was a woman, surrounding and intimidating her last night must have been scary. Not that Hermione had shown any sign of fear that could have replaced her expression of distant or the distant look with which she watched the Manhattan cityscape pass by her window. It bothered the captain that she didn't react. He honestly hoped that, somehow, she would resist the idea of being kept in their custody. Perhaps arguing strongly, or perhaps trying to escape. Not that she would have been successful if she had tried. Since, Following his strict orders, Jarvis was to keep her unaccompanied access to the research floors, the hangar, the garage and the ground floor blocked. However, other than the very reasonable request this morning for stolen goods and personal items, and something about needing to rescue a cat, Hermione had made no move to escape her captivity. It was as if she had already given up, before even trying, and, strangely, this did not reassure the captain. On the contrary, it unnerved him even more. He would have appreciated it if it was made of stronger steel. At least, despite the incredible tension that saturated the air in the vehicle, the trip had been peaceful. No strange incidents. No Ultron in sight. Of all the things they didn't know about Hermione thus far, her address was the most surprising. Apparently she was a neighbor from Soho, living in one of the neighborhood's peaceful and beautiful streets, just a few kilometers from Avengers Tower. He parked on the cobblestone street in front of her address. The 5-story building, built of cast iron and brick, with ivy growing up and covering half the north wall, was a beautiful place. With personality. The type of residence the captain would live in if he could afford it. Natasha, you watch the perimeter. I'll accompany Hermione. The captain shared the task with his teammate. Black Widow's sign of agreement was to jump out of the car in full agent mode. The streets were relatively quiet by Manhattan standards. Passers-by on the sidewalks didn't even spare a glance in the direction of the two individuals wearing spandex suits, totally absorbed by their electronic devices and the hectic rush of big city life. Black Widow walked away, intending to circle the court in a first sweep. Any civilian who looked at her would think she was just a very attractive woman, strolling carefree. But the captain recognized the predatory look beneath the eyelashes that blinked almost flirtatiously. His task, however, was much less fun. He led a sullen Hermione into the well-kept and pleasant building. The door to the property on the 4th floor opened with an easy click to welcome Captain America and Hermione Granger into a cold, silent and dark apartment. One deposited the keys in an ornamental bowl on a sideboard next to the door, and held the passage open for him to enter, then closed it. I imagine the lights are not our friends? She asked, next to him in the entrance hall. Not for the first time, the captain admired her unique cunning. Lights on would warn a stalker who was watching your apartment. It would be a very basic mistake, but also quite common for any civilian. Should an innocent translator of ancient texts pay attention to this type of detail? Captain America's senses tingled with distrust. We can turn on some lamps, however, he chose to say. Instead of asking questions, accepting that it would be impossible to move around the pitch-black apartment. He felt Hermione pass him and walk into the darkness with ease. 2 clicks later, and a soft white light illuminated the room enough to allow them to move around without bumping into the furniture. Hermione's apartment certainly wasn't the lair of a comic book supervillain. It had an open concept floor plan that revealed a kitchen, a dining room, a living room, and 3 back doors that led to other rooms hidden from view. It was decorated with little furniture, just the essentials. But everything was in good taste and with sophisticated finishes. It was more elegant than he would have imagined when considering it, although it was quite cozy. The inviting eye could have to do with the number of books. There were many. In the place where any 21st century house would feature a home theater full of modern electronics, in Hermione's house, on the wall opposite the windows, there was a grandiose bookcase, which went from floor to ceiling, filled with an obscene amount of books, which at some point, obviously, had stopped fitting there, and were organized in almost artistic piles. Throughout the property, Steve could imagine the morning light spilling through the windows, and illuminating a Hermione curled up on the couch, one of her books in her hands. The sound of a shower in the adjacent room woke him up from his abstractions. He really wanted to keep crying, but it wouldn't be chivalrous, so he resolutely decided to wait for Hermione's return. In her fully behaved Captain America mode, he walked nonchalantly towards the comfortable-looking white sofa, which took up a good part of the room, until he tripped over something soft and warm that squeaked, breaking the silence. A plump orange cat, with yellowish eyes and a crumpled face, as if it had run headfirst into a brick wall, stared at Captain America from the ground, with the most insolent and appraising look he had ever seen on a cat. Man and animal stared at each other for a full second, before the feline decided that the captain was harmless, and got out of the way. Not without first casting a disdainful look in the human's direction. He had to be going crazy, he thought, shaking his head with a goofy smile, as his strange owner's strange cat disappeared from view. Steve deposited the shield next to the sofa and sat down to wait, and before he had a chance to regret and reevaluate his promise not to eavesdrop, Hermione returned to the living room. The bath seemed to have done him good. She was wearing a cleaner, newer variation of the jeans and sweater set from the night before, and her wet hair fell in thick, wild curls around her face, flushed from the hot water of the shower. She went to the couch and sat down next to him. "I can ask a question?" Hermione questioned, while passing a towel over her damp hair. "Of course," the captain gladly conceded. "What is an enhanced?" Hermione asked. His whiskey-colored eyes shone with curiosity in the low light of the room. This was the first genuine feeling she showed openly, and despite all the mysteries that surrounded her. Steve couldn't help but notice how the new emotion softened her tortured expression. He smiled at the welcome change, leaning back on the couch that was, in fact, as comfortable as it looked. Enhanced people are people who undergo some scientific intervention that alters their cellular composition. In other words, genetically modified people, he explained succinctly. These changes can lead an individual to develop certain skills. "Like which ones?" she asked, biting her lip. "Of the most varied. As far as I know, most experiments have not been able to constrain or control changes. It could be something like super strength, or super speed, for example." He provided the answer as best he could, without going into further detail. "What about the girl, Maximoff?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and crossing his hands. The movement brought him closer to her. "As far as we know, Wanda voluntarily signed up for an experiment that made her enhanced. We know she has the ability to telekinesis, whatever that means. We don't know for sure the extent of her powers. However, of all the enhanced ones I know, her power is the one that most resembles something intangible. Almost supernatural, like magic. Maybe." Hermione paled at his words. A worried expression made her frown. She got up from the couch and turned her back to Steve. The captain shrugged off her sudden nervousness. How many of these individuals are there?" she asked, running her hands over her arms in an anxious gesture. "Not many. With the Maximoff brothers there are 5. We are not aware of others. Dr. Banner ended up exposing himself to gamma rays in an experiment that went wrong. He undergoes a mutation when he loses control emotionally. Air is a friend of mine who was missing at the moment," the captain confided, instinctively shuddering before continuing, "and me." With a shock of realization, Steve realized that, in his entire life, he had never explained to anyone what it meant to be a super soldier. The need had never arisen, because all the people he approached knew his story and never rejected him because of it. Sometimes, in fact, that was all they saw. The perfect soldier, bottled up in a stereotype of a hero, delimited by a museum exhibition. Once, in a discussion, Iron Man had told him that he was nothing more than a scientific experiment. That everything that was special about him had come out of a mere bottle. Steve had never forgotten those words. He didn't think he ever would. Tony Stark was right. Interestingly, however, the young lady knew nothing about him, which put him, for the first time, in front of the real possibility of being despised, considered just a scientific aberration, as Tony seemed to think. The idea scared him more than he could express. "Do you also transform when you get out of control?" Hermione questioned, turning to look at him, oblivious to the disturbing thoughts that momentarily assaulted Steve. He searched her face for any sign of distaste, but there was none. Still, her heart thumped against her ribs when he replied, "My case is much less dramatic. When I was younger, I applied for an experiment with serum and Vita rays. The aim was to make soldiers more physically prepared for battle. When the experiment ended, I had much more strength, more endurance and agility than my colleagues in uniform. As well as healing faster, among other things." He spoke modestly. Hermione bit her lower lip, as if restraining herself from asking questions, but there was no judgment in her gaze. Just the gleam of earlier curiosity, which significantly softened the sunken appearance of her face. Silence floated between them, and the captain watched as Hermione's shoulders stiffened again. And her almost slightly relaxed expression turned distressed again. She wrung the wet towel she still held in her hands. It was then that he saw it. Under the play of light and shadow in the room, a glow caught his attention. Steve swallowed hard when he noticed the only piece of jewelry she wore. A modest solitaire of antique design, which filled the ring finger of his left hand. Hermione Granger had a fiancé. A fiancé who should be waiting for her right now. Probably desperate with the disappearance of his fragile love. He tried to hide his surprise at the revelation. Why? Oh, you may want to warn someone about your whereabouts. The captain spoke softly, feeling his voice scratch in his tight throat, due to the renewed wave of guilt that assaulted him. Hermione started, shooting him an alarmed look. His breathing became difficult. I don't have anyone who might be interested in this information, she replied softly, rubbing her engagement ring with her thumb. His hands shook uncontrollably. The captain swallowed again, feeling mortified for not having considered earlier the possibility that there were people worried about her. It was impossible to avoid the doubt of keeping her in custody without her consent. If you are afraid for your family or friends, know that we would not harm them. We would never hurt you or them. And if it's Ultron you fear, we can. No, that's not it, she interrupted him, shuddering. The glow of curiosity that had lit up her eyes a little while ago went out, transforming her once again into a specter of suffering. It's just me. There's no one else. Her voice was cracking, but Hermione was deliberately refusing to meet her gaze. She maintained her rigid posture, with her eyes fixed on the hands that still held the towel. But her heavy breathing indicated how much his words affected her. Despite all the distrust, the loneliness that Hermione's words revealed reached Steve intimately. He knew the weight of feeling alone. He knew the feeling better than anyone. He had lost his father when he was still a child, and shortly after, the mother, and then, your best friend, and finally, in World War II, when he mad. His decision to divert a plane loaded with armed bombs, which would destroy half of the United States, he had also lost the only lady he had ever loved. Since then, loneliness was all he knew. The two remained silent for a moment, until finally she managed to look at him again. There was a deep uneasiness in the look she gave him. Hermione sighed heavily. He's dangerous, isn't he? It's really going to hurt people, isn't it? She whispered in the dark, as if she was afraid that Ultron might hear her. He will, the captain stated, with his own whisper. Ultron is endowed with an artificia. Intelligence that goes beyond the reasoning of most men, and above all, he has purpose. Which is scary to contemplate, if you consider he's not human. He attacked us, and would have killed us if he had had the chance. He kidnapped you, and in a way, Wanda and Pietro are also his victims. Ultron needs to be stopped before he can irreversibly hurt people. Hermione closed her eyes tightly and visibly shivered. When she looked back at him, there was a deep horror darkening the beautiful brown of her orbs. It was not the childish fear of the privileged, nor the legitimate fear of the dispossessed. The dread of ordinary people with ordinary lives. It was more than that. It was a transcendent horror. The kind that knows no relief, the kind that crawls beneath your flesh and squeezes your throat with ice-cutting hands. The one who takes everything from you, that takes you, that tears you apart. He who only knows, who has already encountered death, face to face. It was frightening to contemplate. It made the captain shiver. Slowly, very slowly, she walked to one of the corners of the room and turned on a lamp that spilled its light across the wide planked floor, revealing a very ancient-looking trunk. Locked by a heavy padlock. Hermione knelt before it and stroked the carved wooden lid. The captain couldn't say when he had gotten up, but he suddenly realized that he was standing next to her. Observing the chest that he hadn't noticed until now, with a strange fascination. With hands that shook uncontrollably, Hermione lifted the lid of the chest, revealing a mixed content of varied objects. There were some leather-bound photo albums, a hand-knit brick red sweater, some vinyl records, very old and malevolent-looking books, many letters on parchment, and a number of other indistinct objects. Some that seemed to be worth a lot, and others that seemed to be worth nothing. Hermione took a deep breath as she took in the contents, like a shipwreck admiring dry land. After a moment, she pulled out a tiny beaded bag, worn with age and use, and closed the lid of the chest again with a shaky sigh. She stood up, swaying on her feet, her lips blackened and paler than he had ever seen her, looking ready to faint. The captain held out his hands, ready to support her, when Black Widow spoke through the communicator. "They're here," Captain. Natasha's warning shook Steve out of the trance he was in. How many? He asked, raising a hand to silence the question Hermione was about to ask. 4. Until now. I'll try to buy time for you to leave, the widow responded hurriedly. And Maximoff? He can't help but ask. No preview, Black Widow replied. A loud, metallic noise arrived at the point, informing that Natasha was already fighting the androids. Copied, the captain replied, to let his teammate know that he was already on the move. We need to go, he warned Hermione, while retrieving his shield next to the sofa. She blinked in surprise at him, but quickly recovered from the shock and ran to her room, returning seconds later, with a backpack ready. Crookshanks, come here boy, she called in an urgent whisper. The cat stepped out of the shadows and jumped into its owner's open arms. Let's use the fire escapes. Hermione pointed to the windows. Without ceremony, the captain threw open the heavy curtains. The blinding light of day spilled across the room, hurting both of their eyes. He quickly recovered from the blinding flash. Outside, within reach of the window, were vertical cast iron platforms and stairs that snaked up the building to the ground floor. The alley below was empty, with no enemies in sight, providing an excellent escape option that he approved without reservations. You could hear, even from the 4th floor, the noise of Ultron's androids destroying the reception of the building below. He needed to get Hermione out of there as quickly as possible. Without further ado, Steve opened the windows. Come on, he urged Hermione to move. The girl hugged the cat tightly in her arms, and jumped nimbly to the platform outside the window, dismissing the help he offered with his outstretched hand. She started down the first flight of stairs with Captain America following closely behind. However, the stairs were vertical and the steps were very narrow, which prevented faster progress. Above, the door burst inward with a violent crash that sent shards of wood flying through the open window. The androids were inside the house. How long would it take them to realize that their target was on the stairs outside the building? All he didn't need was a frantic fight on the fire escapes. Suddenly, Hermione stopped, still in the middle of the first landing. The captain looked down and found Hermione with her eyes closed, almost strangling a poor kitten with one of her arms, while, with the other, she hugged the stair column in desperation. Hermione? The captain questioned, with his heart pounding with adrenaline. I am unable. I thought I could. The height. I won't make it, she moaned heavily. Look at me, the captain demanded, with all the kindness he could muster at the moment. After a few seconds of uncertainty, she finally opened her eyes and focused on him. We have no choice. We can't go back up there. They are already in your apartment. We need to reach the ground floor. Just put one foot in front of the other. Don't look down. Just focus on the steps. You will make it. She took a deep breath and slowly moved one of her feet to the step below. Very well, the captain encouraged. Now see. Continue until you reach the ground floor. Trembling, like a leaf in the wind, Hermione managed to release her death grip from the stairs, resuming her journey. They were 2 floors short of the ND floor when the droids finally located them. Exactly as he feared, the machines were equipped with thrusters that allowed them to fly. A feat that neither he, nor Hermione, could match. 3 droids flew out the window, taking with them glass, bricks, and molten iron. Hurry up, the captain shouted, but it was the wrong thing to do. Hermione looked up and saw as the robots flew directly towards her. She panicked and her feet slipped on the steps. She struggled to stay on the stairs, but ended up falling with a thud onto the sidewalk below. Steve was horrified. Hermione remained motionless on the concrete. Crookshanks freed himself from her body and, miraculously alive, meowed loudly and tearfully as he licked his owner's face. The androids did not give the captain the slightest consideration, and quickly flew towards their main target. He didn't think twice, even though he was still at the top of the last flight of stairs. The captain jumped down to the ground floor, while reaching for the shield strapped to his back. He landed softly between Hermione and 3 machines that surrounded them menacingly. His shield flew between the machines like a boomerang, but the space to throw it was short. And the effect was not strong enough to destroy them, although at least it forced them to retreat. Civilians passing by on the street next to the alley began to scream as soon as they realized what was happening. Many others pulled out their cell phones to film Captain America destroying robots in Soho. Steve was livid at how absurd it was, people putting their lives at risk, just to take photos. The 21st century was chaos. Get out of here. Go away. Protect yourselves, he shouted, invoking his commanding voice. And he insisted, when few people moved, look for a place to take shelter. Quickly. Before he could ensure everyone was safe, however, a powerful metal punch was delivered to his face, knocking him away. The android that attacked him with an unexpected rain of steel blows. Difficult to contain. Luckily for him, he had fought these things just a few hours ago, and discovered their weaknesses, their lower halves. He finally managed to land a kick to the android's legs, which sent him flying. The machine hit the wall of the neighboring building violently, and shattered into several harmless pieces. The two remaining AIs were carrying a still unconscious Hermione away. The captain threw the shield with all his strength against his opponents, and this time, the blow was strong enough to destroy, with a deafening metal noise, one of the damned things. Hermione was thrown onto the asphalt again. At that moment, Black Widow appeared in the alley to join the fight. The crowd that had formed on the street screamed and cheered enthusiastically as the combined efforts of the two Avengers destroyed Ultron's last android quite easily. The captain strapped his shield to his back and ran to Hermione's side. The girl's face had several small bruises and a bruised lip from which blood was oozing. Hastily, he rolled up one of the sleeves of his sweater to feel his right pulse. Robotic hands had left purple marks on his arm, but luckily the pulse was there. Gently, Steve ran his hand over her face, avoiding the injured parts, to try to wake her up. Crookshanks, who had wisely managed to stay alive during the fight, came to lick Hermione, to add to his efforts. Slowly, she opened her eyes and blinked dazedly at the captain. What happened? She asked, stunned. A small moan of pain escaped his lips. You fell down 2 flights of stairs and hit your head hard. The captain summarized, helping Hermione to sit down. That explains why there are 2 of you, she said, wrinkling her nose at the pile of android wreckage scattered across the alley. Did you get rid of them all? Don't look so surprised. Natasha appeared next to them, shrugging indifferently. We are good at revenge. In attracting confusion, you mean? It's just my luck, Hermione muttered through her teeth. Come on, let's go back to the tower, squeeze you into a tube and check if your bones are still intact, Natasha demanded, jumping over the rubble and going towards the civilians who insisted on remaining on the outskirts of the battle. The show is over, guys. Time to get back to your business. Didn't you learn anything from the alien invasion of New York 4 years ago? Don't make it easy for the villain. Black Widow scolded, firmly shooing people away from the alley, before heading towards her car parking on the next street. Steve reached out his hands to help Hermione up from the dirty concrete floor, but she promptly waved him away, stubbornly using the wall of the building behind her as support to stand up. She faltered slightly as she placed her weight on her left leg. Steve's hand automatically came up to catch her in case she fell. I'm fine, Captain, thanks. She thanked him with a pained expression that suggested otherwise. I would be grateful, however, if you could help me with my cat. Hermione walked away, limping slightly, as she followed behind Romanoff to the car. As if it had understood its owner's every word, the fat pussy, which was playing between Hermione's legs, jumped onto Steve's chest, practically turning Captain America into a glorified dogwalker. Steve had no choice but to follow the 2 ladies, with the orange furball meowing bashfully in his arms. Although his fingers were blackened from the charcoal he deftly slid across the thick paper, in the dawn light, the sketch in his hands didn't look right. He blew away the excess graffiti that appeared from the strongest features and evaluated the image carefully to find the error. The softness of the waves of the brown hair was there, as was the graceful curve of the full lips, but the portrait still did not look anything like the woman who had occupied his dreams so often in recent days. Steve could solve the imperfection in the drawing. All he had to do was open his wallet and retrieve the carefully kept card with the address of the nursing home where Peggy Carter, now Peggy Smith, waited for the end of her days. Then, he could compare his sketch with the model, except for the fact that the lady he would find suffering from Alzheimer's was no longer his girl, not anymore. As fate would have it, Time, that inexorable enemy, would be his executioner. While his life had remained on hold during his sleep on the ice, Peggy had lived each of his 95 years and experienced all the experiences he had once dreamed of for them both. Waking up in 2012, what seemed like just a minute after 1945, was a cruel experience, but no more disorienting than encountering an aging Peggy, just after having sworn love to her 70 years younger self. It was considerably difficult to reconcile her now disturbingly inappropriate feelings with the image of the wife, mother, and great-grandmother that Peggy had become. Despite this, Steve felt deeply grateful that, despite his unusual situation, he at least had the opportunity to meet her again. Even though gratitude did not avoid regret for unlived love, even though there was sadness at not finding in the lady who now only remembered him in rare moments of lucidity the woman he had deeply appreciated in the past, even though having your friendship wasn't anew. To alleviate the emptiness of being so impossibly far from home. Deep down, what he actually feared was that he would never be able to build a future that would match the expectations that the ice had stolen from him. Because no one could surpass the young Peggy who still filled his imagination. Ultimately, it was Wanda Maximoff's fault, who, with her dream that resembled a nightmare disguised as a desire, had revived in Steve the desires that he thought had been overcome. Steve returned to contemplating his sketchpad, finally finding the error in his work. He hadn't managed to capture vivacity that always shone in Peggy's eyes, instead he had drawn sad, lifeless, apathetic eyes. He couldn't explain why, but he had unconsciously seen Mrs. look on Peggy's face. Granger. Steve tore the page from the pad and crumpled the paper between his hands, irritated that his thoughts had wandered to the young woman without permission. This was an insult to Peggy. Unlike Peggy, Hermione didn't seem to be in the mood to lie down on barbed wire so others could get through, judging by her insistence on keeping secret information that could be useful in stopping Ultron, like what the android might want with her, to begin with. He put the sketchpad back on the bedside table and got up from the bed, leaving the tangled sheets behind, evidence of a sleepless night he spent drawing. Dawn that seemed to never end had finally retreated to a day that had been born bright, and he could finally focus solely on the hunt for Ultron, instead of losing himself in old affections for a lady who, although still alive, was only in his past. Changing from his pajamas to his gym clothes, Steve headed to the living room connected to the kitchen, which the team used as a common living room. At this time of the morning, he would probably find everyone awake. As soon as the elevator doors opened, the buzz of conversation confirmed their suspicions. Despite the early hour, everyone was already gathered. Except for Tony, who was either still in bed, or hadn't even gotten to it, having fallen asleep on a bench in the laboratory, as was his custom. However, as if summoned by his thoughts from this morning, it was Mrs. Granger who first came into his field of vision. Immediately, Steve felt naked without his shield, and the familiar pre-battle adrenaline flooded his system, as it always did when he was in her presence. He was aware of the absurdity of this, as she hadn't actually done anything that remotely threatened them, and it wasn't like a gust of wind couldn't knock her out. A heavyweight indeed. Still, rationalization did not silence his instincts that screamed for danger. It was a little bothersome, to say the least, that they couldn't make Stark Tower the resting place everyone needed. Instead, this little intruder placed them on constant alert, on permanent surveillance. Nevertheless, Hermione was standing innocently, leaning against the Carrara marble of the kitchen island, watching the television on with a distraught expression. His fall from the fire escape, which hadn't seemed so serious the day before, had proven more worrying this morning. Steve could notice on the young woman's face the bruises of different shades of color that healed in various stages, added to the tiredness of an obvious sleepless night. With each new day that Miss Granger remained in the tower, she seemed more tired and haggard, which only served to reinforce Steve's resolve to find Ultron as soon as possible, to be able to free her from their presence, which seemed to not please either side involved. Steve greeted the others and headed to the kitchen to help himself to coffee. With a decent-sized mug in his hands, he finally turned to the television. The most watched morning news program in the United States had its screen divided into 3 frames. In the first, a young, blonde reporter told the viewer the story of the android attack on Miss Granger. In the painting below, the images of Natasha fighting at the reception, appeared in an incessant loop. In all its glory of destruction, the doorman's desk was in pieces and the floor had several holes. The entire left half of the screen had the honor of presenting Captain America's fight against the 3 remaining androids. The images were amateurish and shaky and, at times, out of focus, but even so, you could clearly see the moment in which Hermione was thrown by the android onto the concrete floor, his bruised face on display for the eager cameras. Steve saw the flesh and blood version pale next to him. With her eyes glued to the TV, Hermione looked for the stool behind her to sit down. His fingers gripped the edges of the stool so hard that the knots were white. The same distressed look he had drawn earlier marked his face. "Quick action this," Bruce commented in a congratulatory tone, as he watched the cameras show Natasha joining the captain to eliminate the last threat with little effort. "But I expected Ultron to appear, after all, he was so interested in." Bruce fell silent as soon as he saw an anxious Hermione, bending over even more on the stool. Steve swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at his insides. He might not be fond of her taciturn company, but he could feel sympathy for the way Ultron had turned her life upside down, whether Hermione was collaborating with him or not. "Bruce," Steve called with renewed purpose, "how is the construction of the location algorithm going?" "Still no results," the doctor replied, casting a penalized look in the young woman's direction, understanding, like Steve, what was at stake. "Ultron is managing to disable all the mechanisms we have built before the location is processed, and it doesn't help that he constantly disables our access to satellites. Tony and I are working on this tirelessly. I had to take a break, but he's still in the lab. Let's think of a way to help them with this," Steve said, turning his back to the news in time to see Miss Granger leaving the room with a distressed expression. Tony decided to reappear a few moments later. He dragged himself across the room with huge bags under his eyes and marks of fatigue on his face. To corroborate Steve's thesis that he hadn't even slept last night. "Where is Hermione?" he asked dryly, by way of greeting. "I think he returned to his room." "Why?" Steve informed, with a raised eyebrow. "Because she has a visitor," Stark replied, annoyed. "Jarvis, inform Ms. Granger that she must return to the common room immediately." "Of course, sir. Furthermore, I believe you will be pleased to know that the reception has just allowed visitors entry." "He's boarding the social elevator right now," Jarvis announced. An unusual silence among the Avengers followed the news. Everyone had identical expressions of surprise. Steve restrained the urge to exchange worried glances with the team. Instead he gestured for the 4 teammates to move in a sort of semicircle around the common elevator. The precaution was not an exaggeration, considering the mysteries surrounding Miss Granger. Too quickly for them to have time to formulate any other plan. A discreet whistle reverberated through the silent environment, announcing the arrival of the elevator on the floor. Not for the first time that day, Steve cursed himself for letting his guard down and leaving his shield behind. In any case, he only had time left to prepare himself mentally, to face anything that might happen next. However, when the metallic doors opened, the revealed image made him relax his tense shoulders. A single man jumped out. His 60-year-old appearance, although eccentric at best, had no air of being dangerous. He wore a strange, scruffy set of graphite-colored pants and jacket, with orange checkerboard patterns, that even Steve would have considered old-fashioned. A strange cross between a cape and a black toga hung from his thin shoulders, and to complete the look, he carried a worn men's briefcase. More appropriate to the 40s, thinning hair that still maintained a proud reddish color and horn-rimmed glasses framed wrinkled dark green eyes that looked around curiously. The Lord seemed slightly out of place, a feeling Steve understood all too well and couldn't help but feel sympathy for. The man gave an eager half-smile to each of the Avengers, but when he saw Tony Stark, his face lit up. And all of his teeth were exposed in a radiant smile and wide-eyed admiration. He walked with long strides towards Tony, completely ignoring the threatening posture with which the other was staring at him. "Arthur Weasley, Mr. Stark." The man introduced himself with a strong English accent, and extended his hand for an excited greeting, which, very hesitantly, Tony accepted. The old lord grabbed Iron Man's fingers in a tight grip, and shook his entire arm in ecstasy. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I never imagined I would have this honor. I am a great admirer of your work. I can't believe you can fly with that infernal armor." "Thanks." Tony, still without full possession of his hand, thanked him uncertainly. There is no one more enthusiastic about Muggle technology than me. My friends think I'm crazy, can you believe it? The Lord continued chatting happily. I can't imagine why, Tony murmured, with a wrinkle forming between his eyebrows. Could I ask? No, that would be an abuse. But who knows when I'll have that opportunity again. Would you explain to me the function of the sockets, Mr. Arthur asked very excitedly, Completel. Why oblivious to the choking noises that Clint and Bruce made, trying to contain their laughter, given the increasing confusion with which Tony was looking at the stranger. You know, I've been asking this same question for years. But no one has been able to explain to me satisfactorily what they are for. Tony was saved from finding a response to the Lord's strangeness by the arrival of Hermione Granger. The girl looked in shock at the visitor's back, recognizing him immediately. The silence that followed made Mr. Weasley finally let go of Tony's hand, and turned to the newcomer. As soon as he saw Hermione, all of his previous weirdness and excitement was replaced by an expression of disappointment. The two stared at each other in equal measure, although Hermione looked terrified and Mr. Weasley looked angry. It was then that the strangest thing happened. All the lights in the room started to flicker as if they were about to short-circuit and the television went out. In a fraction of the next second, everyone looked at each other, confused by the event, as Tony always talked about exhaustion, how the entire building was energetically self-sustainable and powered by the safest and most stable source of clean energy ever developed by man. All the Avengers knew that an arc reactor didn't collapse. Tony? Steve asked, worried. The last time Stark technology got out of control, Ultron was created. Iron Man was frozen in place. No one seemed more amazed than him. However, before Tony had the chance to respond, the phenomenon ceased. It was nothing. It must have just been a small glitch, Tony assured, already with the phone in his hands, tapping frantically on the screen, but it didn't go unnoticed by Steve, the other's slightly uncertain tone. All energy levels are normal. Everything is going well with the building. Nothing else strange happened for the next minute and it didn't appear that they were under imminent attack, so with the little confusion resolved, everyone was free to turn their attention to the two intruders in Stark Tower. Granger and Weasley continued to stare at each other, and a silent conversation was going on between the two. Mr. W. Weasley looked slightly alarmed when he finally asked Hermione, "Can we talk?" He glanced at the people surrounding them, momentarily serious, and cleared his throat before continuing, "Alone, if it's not inconvenient." Hermione opened her mouth to speak, looking ready to deny the request, but Tony was quick to be strangely helpful. "You can use the meeting room on the upper floor," he offered. Miss Granger gave Tony a pointed look, but apparently without any opposition, she turned to press the button on the elevator panel, which, as they had not yet left the floor, immediately opened the doors to welcome them. Solemnly, she waited for Mr. Weasley to enter before following him inside. The elevator had barely left the floor when the explosion of voices filled the room, firing random questions. What exactly was that bundle of clothes? Should I feel insulted? What it means? And I know. Sockets. Serious. Who is this anyway? What was that with the lights? Should this happen? All of you, shut up, Tony demanded, raising his tone to make himself heard. Jarvis, activate the bugs and the cameras in the meeting room, please. The captain shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uncomfortable. We shouldn't spy on them. He objected immediately. How is digging through private data in government agencies different from this? Tony rolled his eyes, impatient. Much of this data is provided voluntarily. But this is an intimate conversation. That's quite different, Steve argues. We're running into a lot of dead ends when it comes to her, Cap. We've already exhausted all our sources. Without SHIEL D and with Fury Incommunicado in Europe, we have nothing. She responded with the practical logic of a spy. Steve looked around for support, but it soon became clear he wasn't going to get it. The Avengers seemed to agree with her point of view. Okay. After a moment of hesitation, Steve reluctantly consented. Great. Stark sighed, impatiently, if no one has any further objections. Jarvis, start recording and release the images to us. Make a list for later research, write down any unfamiliar names, places or terms. Start with Arthur Weasley and the term, muggle. If I'm going to be insulted, I at least want to know what. Done, sir, the EA replied promptly. Immediately, the 65-inch television turned back on, showing a perfectly clear image of the still empty meeting room. The cameras were installed at different angles, allowing there to be no blind spots in the entire room. A heavy silence fell in the room between the Avengers, everyone paying attention to the monitor. Even though he wasn't happy with the invasion of privacy, Steve decided he would attend the meeting, which he hoped would actually clear up the loose ends about Mrs. Granger, once and for all. Soon after, the door to the meeting room was opened and Mr. Weasley entered accompanied by Hermione. The two stood on the threshold for a moment. The discomfort between them was obvious, even on camera. Do you want to sit down? Hermione indicated the chairs that surrounded the large glass and steel table, before walking uncertainly towards the large window that flooded the room with morning light. His voice came through the room's speakers loud and clear, as if everyone were in the same room. The Lord ignored the offer, calmly removing his cloak and revealing the full extent of his hideous plaid suit. He folded his coat carefully, as if the action required all his concentration. When finished, he placed it on the table, before putting his hands in his pockets. It was only then that he focused his attention on Mrs. Granger. The girl had chosen to remain standing. With her back to him, Hermione began to contemplate the city through the large window. For a moment, the two were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, but after a while, Mr. Weasley cleared his throat, intending to begin the conversation. However, before he had the chance to speak, Hermione hurriedly turned to him. Careful, the room is likely bugged, she warned, as if the thought had occurred to her at the last moment. Steve couldn't help but glance in Tony's direction. He genius seemed slightly disconcerted that he wasn't the only smart person in the room. The captain was almost proud of Miss Granger, almost. He turned his attention back to the television when Mr. Weasley finally spoke. Oh, yes, well, that's a shame for you, my dear, because it won't stop me from saying what I came to tell you, he replied categorically. His face was a mask that revealed nothing. Hermione looked away, as if she couldn't bear to look at him, while hugging her torso. The movement made his sweater stretch over his skeletal body, marking his thin form. Mr. Weasley's cotton lost a little strength in the face of Miss Weasley's gaunt image. Granger, are you injured? He asked, in a softer tone this time. The question was rhetorical. It was quite evident from the amount of bruises on her face that Hermione was hurt. Although she wasn't limping like the day before, she still dared to shake her head no. Mr. Weasley raised an eyebrow with a skeptical expression. It was just a few scratches, nothing major, she assured, stubbornly. He huffed in indignation, but did not insist again. How have you been? He asked instead. Hermione just shrugged, indifferently. You've been making new friends, I see. The man persisted patiently, referring to the Avengers, with a wide gesture around the room. They are not my friends. She made a point of clarifying. Well, that's a shame. The Lord sighed sadly. Are you working? I work at the Metropolitan Museum. The man leaned on the sideboard behind him and crossed his arms in front of his chest, casting a critical look at the girl. Locked between four walls and surrounded by old, dusty things, I bet, he guessed, with a knowing air. It seems to be very healthy. Again an apathetic shrug of the shoulders was all Mrs. reply. Granger. Silence reigned between them again, but this time, it seemed to Steve, that the man was hesitant to continue, as if he feared the question itself. At least, met someone. Are you dating? He asked uncertainly, his voice breaking slightly. Hermione jumped in place, turning fully to face the Lord across the room, a mortified expression on her pale face, as if the question was an irreparable offense. She shook her head, swallowing hard. The captain saw how she ran her thumb over her engagement ring, in an anxious gesture, which also didn't go unnoticed by Mr. Weasley. The man admired the jewelry for a moment, with a mixture of disappointment and relief crossing his aged face, which confused Steve. A heavy atmosphere hovered between the two, tangible even for the Avengers who watched the interaction in absolute silence. How did the Lord manage to find me? Finally, Hermione decided to ask her own question, but her voice was no louder than a hoarse whisper. Mr. Weasley stiffened at the question. All the coldness returned to his face, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window next to Hermione and began to observe the street below. With his hands in his pockets, he took a breath before answering, still without looking at her. That's an excellent question, but you always knew how to ask the right questions. Because in fact, that's the crux of the whole issue here, isn't it, Hermione? Since we've been looking for you for over 3 years. In the end, after all the difficulties we faced, after all the efforts, after all the dead ends we reached and clues that led nowhere, finding her was actually quite simple. He was very angry, as he turned fully to her and continued. A fight between Captain America and robots. Not even we could ignore this, no matter how reclusive we are. We are not totally alienated when it comes to the world, this place. Your face is in each of these things. He pointed to the switched-off monitors that substantially occupied an entire wall of the room. Once the images started appearing, and it became obvious that it was you, it was easy to find your new address. Hermione shuddered at the disappointment of how the Lord looked at her. She closed her eyes and sighed resignedly. Can you answer me honestly why you were running away from us? Why did you let us think you were dead? The Lord asked, struggling to control the anger that was bubbling to the surface. Miss Granger didn't respond, didn't seem capable of doing so. Instead she ran her fingers over her engagement ring again. With a dismayed expression, the way Hermione held on to that ring, as if that tiny piece of gold was capable of keeping her on the surface of a raging ocean, made Steve remember his own souvenir, the compass with Peggy's photo on it, which he carried with him wherever he went. Steve knew why he kept his relic close, he would like to know why Hermione kept hers. Suddenly he wished Mr. Weasley would go away and leave her alone. He silently decided that if she asked the man to leave, he would make sure it happened himself. The old lord's shoulders slumped at the poor girl's devastated sight. He looked like he wanted to cry, but instead he took off his tortoiseshell glasses and cleaned the lenses with a handkerchief he took from his jacket pocket as he tried to gain some control over his emotions. Hermione was shaking when she finally managed to speak, after another very long period of silence. How is Harry? She asked. The Lord just looked at her for a while, seeming resigned to the fact that he wouldn't get a direct answer to his question. Finally, he replied, at first, when news of you arrived, I thought he would be ecstatic, that he would make a point of coming to meet you in person. And he was actually getting ready to do that, but at the last moment, he asked me to replace him. The Lord glanced at Hermione. He was deeply hurt, very shocked. Ken, to know that you were so close to home. Hermione flinched, as if the Lord had stabbed her in the heart. Despite this, he continued, indifferent to the overwhelming pain that overflowed across her pale face. I don't blame him. In recent years, everyone has had the opportunity to rebuild their lives, but not him. There was no rest for Harry, with a baby to raise alone, you missing, so many friends lost, at one point. I really thought he was going to succumb, but Harry, bless him, is stronger than his gentle and accommodating nature suggests. He had spent the last 3 years focused solely on finding her. Created a permanent interdepartmental task force. He used every ounce of influence, demanded favors and owed many others, to people with whom, we know, he would prefer not to get involved. He did everything he could. And many things he couldn't, to locate her. The Lord paused, suddenly looking older than he really was. The space you occupy in that boy's life, none of us were able to fill, not even Gina. There's nothing he wouldn't do for you. He never gave up on finding her. A sob escaped Hermione's lips and silent tears fell down her dismayed face. Mr. Weasley sighed, looking at her in dismay. I didn't come here to punish you, Hermione, or demand answers that you aren't ready to give yet, he said in an apologetic tone, but I can't lie to you and say that we live well with the threat of your death hanging over us. Hermione reached behind her for the table, falling onto one of the chairs, shaking and pale. Steve feared she was going to pass out. Mr. Weasley knelt in front of her, carefully taking the young girl's face in his wrinkled hands. You know, child, during all these years, it was always Molly who disciplined our children. I was always too soft, and God knows what kind of men they would have become if they had only had me to educate them. But now that my wife is gone, that Bellatrix has taken her from me, from us. Unfortunately, it is up to me to fulfill the role I have always avoided playing, and although I hate it more than you can imagine, I truly think that this is the only solution. I know it's what you need, no matter how painful it is, but that's the truth. Isn't it? Hermione tried to move away from the hand holding her face as if his words were burning her. No, you will listen to me. You owe me this, he demanded. Ed and she stopped squirming. When I look at you and see what you've become, it breaks my heart. What did you do to the woman who faced unimaginable dangers to stand up for what she thought was right? Where is the girl who founded FALE? Dumbledore's army. Hermione jumped on the chair, surprised. Oh, yes. Did you really think that anything had ever escaped Albus Dumbledore's notice? Of course we know that it was your initiative. That you organized the resistance against Umbridge. We know everything, Hermione, everything you've ever done, big or small. With compassion, Mr. Weasley wiped away the tears that persisted in falling down her face. I don't know at what point you assumed that we would love her less, because of what happened that day, in that tragedy, that could never, ever happen. He continued, and now it was he who had his voice choked. But you need to stop this, baby. You need to stop blaming yourself, you need to stop this loud pity. This doesn't suit you. You need to stop running away and face what happened, with courage, the Gryffindor courage that I know is still inside, because, Hermione, there is no place you can hide from yourself. With these words the girl collapsed into Mr. Weasley's arms. He hugged her tenderly and also cried silently while Hermione sobbed with her head buried in his chest. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally let go of the Lord's arms and leaned back in the chair with her face marked by tears and tiredness. Maybe you think I don't have the right to ask you this, but I'm going to ask it anyway, if not for myself. Then for Harry, who deserves much more from you than you've given him. You need to forgive yourself for what happened, because only you can do it for yourself. Mr. Weasley placed a kiss on Hermione's forehead before staggering up from the floor. Think about my words and about the person you really are and are pretending not to be. When you're ready, we will be too. He walked across the room and retrieved the cloak, unfolding it to put it on. After a long time, he spoke again. Were those things machines after you, or was it just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mr. Weasley asked, with an eyebrow raised suspiciously, his tone returning to normal. Hermione didn't offer a direct answer. However, that wouldn't be necessary, judging by the understanding that crossed Mr. Weasley's face. A slight resigned smile lifted the corner of one of his lips. It's just your luck, I suppose. He repeated the same words she said the day before, which made Hermione give him a sad half-smile. Despite everything, will you need help? There's no need to worry, we'll find a way. Hermione pointed to the surrounding building, in imitation of the gesture that Mr. Weasley had used earlier, to refer to the Avengers. I hope so. The Lord spoke, looking at her with a deadly serious expression. Be careful, Hermione. Merlin's order or not, I fear that no one, not even Harry, will be able to free her from Azkaban again. The young woman nodded in agreement. Can I ask a favor? She whispered shyly. Tell Harry I'm fine, tell him I'll look for him as soon as I can. Tell him that I love him, that he was always in my thoughts. I didn't think about saying anything different, Mr. Weasley promised. Picking up his battered briefcase from the floor and heading towards the door, he gave one last sad goodbye look to Mrs. Granger, before leaving.